Hi, and welcome to the Spanish Inquisition for the SCA. My name is Jelana Vavkivna, and I will be your instructor today. So we're going to start out talking about the methods that were used in the Spanish Inquisition, and then in a separate video we're going to talk about the perpetrators, the victims, Jewish responses, and finally post-period history and debates that academic historians have about the topic. So, without further ado, let's get started. There were inquisitions before the Spanish Inquisitions, and there continue to be inquisitions, although not as violent today. The Spanish Inquisition was different in that it was targeting Jews and in the level of violence seen. I intend to talk today a little about how we got to the Spanish Inquisition, the perpetrators, the victims, and the methods used, although I don't plan to be any more graphic than the nightly news was when talking about torture in Guantanamo Bay. Along with specific perpetrators, I plan to discuss Spanish society and how it enabled the Inquisition and encouraged it against their neighbors. The First Inquisition came to exist under the Roman Empire and targeted the polytheists who, a mere generation before, represented the official religion of the empire. The Inquisition under the Roman Empire and early Middle Ages dealt with heresy within the Church rather than Judaism and Islam, and rather than other crimes such as sodomy, as were prosecuted under the Spanish Inquisition later. Despite the fact that the Inquisitor of the Faith was already a title and persecutions were ongoing, Pope Innocent III is considered the founder of the Holy Inquisition as an integral part of the Church. This is because persecuting heretics moved from the secular arm to the church arm under his jurisdiction. Although executions were still left up to the secular arm, and abandonment to the secular arm became a euphemism for killing a person by fire, other punishments were undertaken by the church and within the walls of the physical church. In addition, the church became the prosecutorial arm and the investigational arm. Before we get started, let's examine some history of Spain and Jews in Spain prior to the Inquisition. In 586, Visigoth rule in Spain became increasingly prejudiced against Jews and was characterized by anti-Jewish legislation. The Byzantine Empire took over large parts of Spain, and they were also anti-Jewish. Jews were forbidden from owning Christian slaves, which in practice meant any slaves, since their slaves would merely convert to Christianity and need to be freed. They also required that children born from intermarried couples were to be raised as Christians. The children of any new Christians who were deemed to have relapsed were removed from the home and raised as Christians by foster parents. In 613, there was the first round of enforced conversions, when King Sisebut demanded that all Jews in his realm convert. According to Christian sources, 90,000 Jews converted. Converts whose sincerity was in question were forbidden from giving testimony in a court of law. Forced converts known to perform Jewish rituals were given away as slaves. So as you can see, things were already bad for crypto-Jews. However, they got a lot worse once the Europeans reconquered Spain. Before that could happen, Arab rule dramatically improved the position of Jews, and they were largely not persecuted for hundreds of years. Spain was a sort of refuge for Jews from other parts of Europe to escape persecution, until the Almohades dynasty, which again offered the Jews the choice convert or die, this time to Islam. During this time, Spain became the largest population of Jews outside of the Holy Land. This would create a major crisis when Jews were ordered to convert or die. Although not specifically aimed at Jews, in 1215 Pope Innocent backed a bull that threatened excommunication towards any prince who failed to eliminate heresy from his kingdom. This was an early attempt at denying liberty of conscience to princes, and came as a power play between the church and state, but many crowns would take it seriously. Excommunication meant that you could no longer receive the sacraments, which condemned your soul to hell because you couldn't confess your sins or have communion, even on your deathbed. These heresies that were condemned were not other religions, but rather either believing humans to be too close to God or too far from God, rather than the happy medium that church had pretty arbitrarily decided upon centuries earlier. It was aimed at Christian sects but was ultimately used against conversos. In the 13th century, 2 men approached the Pope and asked to be allowed to create mendicant orders to remove heresy from Christian lands. One of these wanted to use force and the other persuasion. Both were permitted to exist, but the Dominicans, the order that believed in force, became the leaders of the Inquisition and were much more successful and popular. By the same time period, there were laws both for and against forced converts. On one hand, it was illegal to forcibly baptize someone. On the other, if someone were forcibly baptized, they were obligated to live as a Christian for the rest of their lives, as it was considered impossible to undo a baptism, which was considered a sort of magical rite. Jews could not acknowledge this magical aspect of baptism without acknowledging Christianity as a valid faith, so they were willing to accept forced converts back into the fold. However, this led many of them to their deaths. In 1349, the Black Death came to Spain, and Jews were blamed for the outbreak because it affected them less than it did the Christians, largely because Jews bathed. Laws were passed requiring Jews to dress differently than current fashion and live apart in ghettos. They were forced to wear badges and desist from using Christian names. They were not allowed to sell meat, bread, wine, or flour, which of course makes keeping kosher meat or kosher for Passover matzo illegal. Mendicant orders were allowed to preach in synagogues, and Jews were required to listen patiently. The only good news was that Jews were allowed to pick their own judges in civil proceedings. Because they blamed the Jews for the Black Death, the Dominicans offered them the choice between baptism and death, once again despite laws forbidding this. It was later considered that being given an option between baptism and death offered a legitimate choice, and these Jews would be required to keep the faith they had been forced to adopt. Many tried to flee, although there weren't many places that would take them. The exception to this was the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan welcomed them warmly. In 1391, violence erupted against the Jewish communities throughout Spain. 30,000 to 50,000 Jews were murdered. Hundreds of thousands more converted to Christianity in order to avoid being murdered. More converted when judges offered to pay 20,000 pounds of their collective debt. These Jews were not given any kind of education in Christian thought, practice, or religion. They were just expected to know it already. Most did not. Instead, they continued living as Jews who also happened to go to church on Sunday. However, they kept the Sabbath holy on Saturdays, did not eat pork, and circumcised their children. Eventually, the old Christians became jealous of the new Christians getting positions in government and church. They instituted purity of blood laws that said no one of Jewish heritage could take certain positions. They formed a more or less permanent underclass of Jewish Christians who weren't considered Jewish by the Jews nor considered Christian by the Christians. This situation festered for about 100 years without a solution, until 1478 when the Catholic Church instituted the Spanish Inquisition, which tortured and killed people for participating in Jewish rites. At the same time, leaving the country was illegal and punishable by becoming a slave, so people had no choice but to take their chances with the Inquisition. In the early years of the Inquisition, it paid little attention to Jews who had not converted to Christianity, although it had the authority to force a Jew to testify against a converso. The exception to this was that it occasionally burned or banned books it deemed heretical to the Catholic Church. Despite their best efforts, the Inquisition failed to maintain a separation between Jew and converso continued Judaizing. When they continued to be arrested for Judaizing among conversos, Torquemada and the crown decided that they had to remove all the unbaptized Jews from the country in order to separate Jews from Christians physically and make it impossible for Jews to teach conversos their religion or provide them with matzah and kosher meat. In March 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella announced an edict effecting the removal of the Jews. Many more Jews converted rather than leave the only home they had ever known. This all happened in 1492, the same year that Ferdinand and Isabella finally managed to consolidate control of the peninsula. This was not a coincidence. Jews were largely responsible for financing the war against the Moors, the Reconquista. It wasn't until this source of funding was no longer needed that it was convenient for the crown to get rid of the Jews. As we also know, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue and made Spain the richest kingdom in the world, so the funding Jews provided was no longer necessary for the royal coffers. By the 16th century, eating pork had become a kind of shibboleth to determine whether someone was a secret Jew. Despite being nauseated by the smell, conversos ate pork in public to make it known that they were Christians. Others pretended vegetarianism to avoid having to eat pork. Another way Jews were found out was that people would climb to rooftops on Shabbat and look to see who had no fire going in their home, as a Jew will not light a fire on Shabbat. Another test was being circumcised, which seems particularly cruel since it's a thing your parents would do to you before you could consent. If a child was found circumcised, both the parents and child were arrested by the Inquisition. Other signs included changing linens on Friday before the Sabbath, buying vegetables before Passover, blessing children without making the sign of the cross, fasting on Yom Kippur, and refraining from work while on the Sabbath, which Jews celebrate on Saturday rather than the Christian Sunday. In addition, working on Sunday was considered potentially Jewish. One final test was pouring out water from the house in which someone had died, believing that the soul of the dead would bathe in it before setting out on its journey to the afterlife. This came from a medieval Jewish tradition of doing so, which may have had several meanings and actually was borrowed from French Christians, but was carried through the Jewish tradition to Spain and not followed by Christians there. Anyone could accuse any converso of being a secret Jew, and often accusations were made because two men happened to get angry at one another, and were made without any regard for the truth. Christian slaves of heretics were freed, giving the slaves an incentive to accuse any converso owners of heresy. Even if a full confession were made and the person reconciled to their church, the slaves would be freed. Because of the possibility for a condemned man to get revenge on his accusers, he was never told who his accusers were nor what they had said. Instead, he was asked, "Why do you think you're here?" and led into confession. It was considered that someone accusing someone else must be saved at all costs, or else other people wouldn't be willing to come forward and make accusations. Inquisitors were warned not to be too precise in their questioning, or else people who may guess who had condemned them, and they were not supposed to suggest answers to the accused so that the accused could not confine himself to those answers the inquisitors already knew. By keeping things vague, he might give up persons previously unsuspected. They were promised pardon, but then told it was pardoned by God, not earthly authorities, and although they'd be killed, they'd go to heaven. It was considered that if torture were permitted, certainly deceiving someone was permitted to extract a confession. At times, the inquisitors were gentle with a prisoner, offering him salvation and grace, which turned out to mean death, if only he would confess and give them other names. An inquisitor was only allowed to torture a man under certain conditions. One of these was that the accused contradicted himself, and this was the most used since after months and weeks of repeating the same subjects, it becomes almost impossible for even an innocent man not to contradict himself in some way. Inquisitors may send a supposed friend or rabbi or other seemingly beneficent person to talk to. Of course, these were always disguised inquisitors, and anything said to them would be reported to the Inquisition. This person was not allowed to actually state that they were a friend, because to do so would be to commit a sin. However, allowing the accused to believe anything they wished to believe was allowed. People were tortured, but they were not supposed to die or bleed, and if they did, the inquisitor was guilty of an irregularity and had to confess. The accused could demand an advocate, which would be provided, but was required to recuse himself if it became obvious the accused was guilty. The accused had to pay the advocate out of his own property. Torture could only be legally conducted once, but inquisitors regularly took a break overnight and continued rather than repeated it on the next day. This is a technicality without a difference, not forbidden because the men who formulated the law never imagined the distinction might be made. There were 5 types of torture, the first 4 of which are mental torture, and only the 5th is about bodily torture. These are the threat of torture, being conducted to the torture, stripping and preparing for the ordeal, laying or binding upon the instrument, and the actual torture. There were at least 14 different types of physical torture, and others, such as sleep deprivation, were imagined. As a rule, both in torture and punishment, the inquisitors avoided novel ideas. They usually resorted to 3 ideas for torture. These were the rack, torture of the hoist, which involved tying the arms behind the back and lifting and dropping the person, using their body weight to dislocate their shoulders, and water torture, more recently called waterboarding. The inquisitors assumed the guilt of anyone brought before them. There was no way to escape once you were arrested. It was assumed that if they burned an innocent man, which they almost certainly did regularly, that person would become a martyr and receive glory in heaven. It was considered a boon, a privilege, to be enjoyed with profound gratitude towards the inquisitors who allowed it. Those who admitted to Judaizing might survive, and might even get out of prison. This was done under an edict of grace, which asked that anyone who was guilty of heresy come forward willingly, and they would escape with their lives if they fully confessed and gave names of others who had committed heresy with them. At least 20,000 conversos came forward to make a confession. Most people who came before the Inquisition did not survive. They would be marched stripped to the waist and barefoot through the snow in a yellow sack holding a candle. At the head of the procession, a black-robed Dominican led holding a green cross of the Inquisition, followed by the doomed men, followed by the inquisitors. They were taken to the church to hear a sermon. Then they were marched in procession to the stakes that would be tied and burned alive. If they had confessed to Judaizing and had been brought back into the church, they would be strangled to death before the fires were lit. Otherwise, they would be burned alive. Burnings continued at such a pace, once started in February, that by November 298 people had been burned to death, and 79 had been permitted to live with life in prison. Death was no escape. If someone thought a person had Judaized before his or her death, his or her bones could be exhumed and burned at the stake, and all property confiscated from the heirs, even if a 3rd generation of heirs was currently in possession of it. This was by no means rare. So that's the first video for the Spanish Inquisition class. I'll post the second one in just a moment, and we'll go over the perpetrators and the victims.